Okay. In our final session of the workshop, we'd like to get a business perspective. And our first speaker is Karen Long from Abott Molecular.
Good morning, everyone. As I've said here for the last day and a half, I find it's very interesting to listen to what is being said and discussed. And it's also reassuring to know that within industry, we have these exact same discussions. So I guess in that respect, it's refreshing. We're all on the same boat. We're trying to steer the boat all in the right direction. It's a matter of how and when we get there. What I'm going to do today is very briefly go through what we do as a manufacturer from a very high level development, how we participate in clinical studies, how those studies are designed to meet our end goal. But I think it's also important to know that we develop one product. Those products are worldwide. In my area, we are dealing with many regulatory bodies around the world. It's also refreshing to know that we're all still thinking and always will be thinking about the patient. And so therefore, as we look for the design of these studies and the writing of our labeling for the end user, not being it the physician, the laboratory pathologist, that we're giving them information that they can share. Is it all inclusive? Absolutely not. It's still up to the physician to practice medicine. We're providing the information from the snapshot of the studies that were performed in a particular clinical application. As we work with these governments around the world, the other item that's important to understand is they also have laws and regulations which they must abide. But they're all working very diligently with industry to make sure that as we look at these next generation applications, that we truly are going to provide the highest quality product for you as physicians to use in the treatment of your patients. It's still our ultimate goal. So today, I always do that. I think I just shut me off. There we go. So today, we are talking about companion diagnostics, and therefore that's going to be around my discussion. I'm not going to give you definitions. I'm not going to give you detail. Everyone knows what that means. I had to smile today when I heard someone talk about personalized medicine. It's probably a term that gets overused today. As with any decade, there's a term of the decade, and who knows, maybe next decade we'll be coming up with something else to be used, as well as companion diagnostics. Real high level on how we develop our products, the concept to approval and how that works when we're with our pharmaceutical partners moving through the development cycle. What are some challenges that we're facing today, looking forward, of which you have hit on many of them already? And I'm going to draw some conclusions around what we are doing today. So as I said, we're always focusing on the product and the patient. We want to make sure we're going to provide that high quality patient information to the patient. What's also important is we know it has to be accessible. We are a worldwide distributor of test products, and therefore we design them with that in mind. We know we have to have proven clinical utility, also is just as important, and that is not just for registration. I heard someone talking about collecting additional information about the patient demographics. We collect a lot of that, and it's not necessarily for registration purposes. It's because we do want to collect that information to make future assessments of that population. And of course, clinical validity, which is a term that you will hear associated with test products within the United States mainly. And then obviously we want to make sure they're accurate and reliable in that regardless of the lot number or changes to the product, you're still going to get that same result day 1 that you would get on day 10 if that's what's required. We have a very complex network. As I said, we're worldwide. The pharma partner has to look at their studies from a different perspective on the outcome, not only progression-free survival, outcome survival. We design those studies based on their objective as well as the objective of the device. We really do want to improve quality of life. We do collect that information as well during, the pharma partner does. Most pharmaceutical companies today actually have very focused groups of functions within their organization that concentrate on collecting quality of life data during their studies. We also want to make sure that these labs also have results in a time frame in which they would normally have in the day-to-day world. So these studies are designed for that turnaround importance to the physician during the studies, and we track that as well. To be successful from a commercial perspective, you've heard a lot of comments the last 2 days about the acceptance and how it's viewed in the medical practice. We do have outreach. We try and educate the physicians, the labs, the payers. We talk to advocates. We have focused staff for physicians. We have key opinion leaders that we're constantly talking to. A lot of healthcare professionals. And this is one forum in which we get good feedback on what's going on in the oncology world. So it's very important for us that from an industry perspective that we hear all this, not only for current studies, current products in development, but for future products as well. We partner early, which is very important when you're looking at a biomarker and a disease progression or a drug that's being developed for a specific pathway. We like to get in at the pre-phase 1 because that's when we're looking at validation of a particular biomarker for a pathway, and not validation from a device perspective, but validation that that's the appropriate biomarker for the compound that is being developed. So this is our goal. We always like to be early from a device perspective, not that that happens all the time, but that is always our goal. So if we look at what we must do as a device manufacturer, we're not just providing we're providing a test result, but a lot goes into the development of that test result, and there's a lot of parts and pieces that have to be evaluated and put together from an overall perspective from a system. As you can see here, from the sample preparation to the result reporting, all this has to be integrated and included in our product labeling and our development as we go into our clinical studies. This is a very busy slide. I don't expect anybody to read the small print. What this is showing you that as we go through our phases of development, we have phase 0 through phase 4 as well, is the different aspects that are happening at each of the phases. Phase 0 is where we really are gathering information not only from our pharmaceutical partner in the development of the clinical studies for companion diagnostics, but we're also gathering all other input as we move forward. At the phase 1 is when we truly understand from a feasibility perspective that we have a functioning product. We're working on the data that would need to be presented to regulatory bodies around the world for investigational device exemptions. Sometimes we do independent, like in the US, we can also provide that same information in the investigational new drug application. But this is where you really start working with the regulatory bodies around the world, because it's very important that at the end of this cycle, at the end of phase 2, we have the product that's going to commercial. In fact, in these clinical studies that are companion diagnostics, the product is essentially locked at the start of those studies. We are not making changes after that point, especially when it comes to the actual design or the primer probe selection. That's done at that very phase 0, phase 1, and it is locked at that point moving forward. We have systems that are put into each of the clinical sites that we have around the world. It's important to note that even though my slides moving forward are US-centric, all these studies are worldwide. Remember, we talked about the importance of providing results back to clinicians who are the investigators from a drug perspective, that they get those results in the time frame that's been decided between the companies and the physicians. So these are constantly worldwide studies that go on past approval. Every country has different requirements from an endpoint perspective. Some will approve on progression-free for survival, others will not and want outcome survival for full approval. So, and of course, no one, almost always there is some phase 4 commitment to go to that next look at data cutting, but not always. And more in oncology, we're seeing fewer of those phase 4 studies. From a regulatory directive, it's more from a pharmaceutical perspective in moving forward and looking at different populations and different indications. We do total product life cycle. So we do a lot of talking about what we do as we develop a product for worldwide use. We don't just make and develop the product and put it on the market and never look at it again. And the reason for that is in the surveillance programs, we're constantly looking to see if there's other markers that should be added to this particular patient population, or in reverse, if there's a product that's been approved and on the market with one pharmaceutical drug, is there another one that we should also start evaluating to also include that in our labeling? I'll touch on that a little bit later because that is a huge challenge for us. The reason I have here the QSRs in red, not because it's a bad thing, it's just this is a US-centric slide that says that in the United States, we as IVD device manufacturers have very specific regulations that we must apply. And of course, our pharmaceutical partners have separate regulations that they must apply. They are complementary of each other, they're not divergent, but we do have separate regulations which apply to the product in which we're developing. So I wanted to touch a little bit on what's happening outside of the United States and inside the United States. So in the US, most of the devices, well, all of the devices are either approved by Center for Drugs and Center for Biologics from a drug perspective. The IVD device is Center for Devices that I have here and Center for Biologics. The drug can also be drugs and CBER as well, whether it's if it's a biologic. The parts and pieces get reviewed by separate offices. Over the last several years, there's been good correlation between the two centers and cooperation, which makes it very useful for both of the device company and the pharmaceutical company. The clinical utility data, the primary reviewer is the drug side of the US FDA, so the Center for Drugs would be the primary reviewer. However, Center for Devices, or CBER, is also very much involved because that ultimate labeling and that data goes in the device labeling as well. So the primary reviewers use Center of Drugs with consult from device. The specific device sections of the application stay with the expert, which is the device side. I'm sure you all know this. All of our products, and this is worldwide, are based and on risk classification. All companion diagnostics worldwide are high risk, and in some countries they are treated like drugs. So even though the processes are different, they're a lot alike. So both drugs and devices have phases in which they go through to identify the indication, or in our case, identify the population. What is that specimen type going to look like? What's the population that we're going to be looking at? What's the best method or technology to use for this particular indication and population? So all this starts very early we like from a device to start at that preclinical and phase 1. More and more what we're seeing today, in fact, all the studies that we're doing today started in that phase 1, so that as we move into phase 2 and we look at the design of that drug phase 2 study, more and more, especially within the United States, those studies are being designed in such a way that they will file with that phase 2 data with the phase 3 ongoing as they move through the approval process. So lots of times phase 2 and phase 3s are run in parallel, and at the conclusion of the phase 2, depending on the evaluation of the data, our partner may decide to file. What does that mean for us as a device manufacturer? The minute we see that protocol from a drug manufacturer and look at the design of that phase 2, we determine that, you know what, this is powered in such a way, and they've designed the study in such a way that if the outcome is good, they're going to be filing. So we then fast track everything that we need to make sure that at the end of their phase 2, if they're going to be filing, we need to be ready, because we have to file our final application module in the US at the same time the new drug application is filed. So we work very closely with the agency during this whole process. It's not a one-time call. This is what we're going to do. If this happens, we're on the phone saying this is what's going to happen. This is how the modules are going to come into the agency for review. The agency, in our case, Center for Devices, agrees with that approach, and then we move forward. So it's keeping everybody in the loop is very, very important on both sides. And I can tell you from a partnership perspective, we have a governance process in place where we're talking to our partners on a weekly basis. We have steering committees at a pretty high level from a senior management perspective to keep handle on what's going on. If it's a fast-paced study, we want to make sure all the resources are in the right place to make sure the project is successful. So I talked about that we really want these reagents at this early lab testing. Doesn't have to be the final product at that point, but we want to be there providing probes, primers, or primers at that phase 1 as they go through the various biomarker evaluations. And it might be several probes that they're looking at that particular stage, but we want to make sure that we're there. So if they are using and they identify the probe or probes that they want to move forward, that it's coming from us and that's the probe that we will take to market. That's been a very good model for us. It has worked in the past. It makes less, we don't like to do bridging to whatever that initial phase 1. If that phase 1 was multiple probes from multiple manufacturers, it makes our bridging a little more difficult, a lot more difficult. So we really do like to be in that pre-stage. And more, that's where we see the pharmaceutical companies coming to us, is in this preclinical phase 1 stage. And in our terminology, that would be our research product that we're providing through that phase. So they're not really in true clinicals. It's all in-house work at that point for them. We start our clinical trials and our final scientific studies, or scientific studies that we as an IVD manufacturer might want to do from a lab perspective. There are some of those scientific studies that get done as well. Those start during the phase 3 equivalent to the pharmaceutical partner. And then, as you can see, NDA and PMAs all get filed at the same time, and approval happens at the same time in the United States. This is not always true around the rest of the world. We've seen in some countries, well, they will go ahead and approve the device minus the clinical utility data, and then as soon as the drug clinical data, we immediately adjust our labeling and they approve. It's very similar to the module effect that I talked about in the US. So they've completed all their review of all the scientific verification work that's required of us, but then have moved on and are just finally looking at the clinical utility data that includes in the labeling. I've talked about the simultaneous NDA and PMA reviews. We won't go through this. The difference in the approval processes is quite different. So when you have an accelerated review, you're essentially taking this 18 to 24 month review you would normally see down to 6 months or less. So you're really compounding that review. So it's really important that the module process gets started early and that the regulatory bodies are in the loop and ready to go the minute those first start hitting the door. If we talk about Japan, they're very sophisticated at this point when it comes to companion diagnostics. They have a very specific process in which they follow. China is going in that direction. They're about ready to issue another guidance document. Other countries are moving in that same direction, similar to the one we have here in the United States. Lastly, let's talk about some of the challenges. We do have multiple regulatory agencies, including the US FDA, and this can cause confusion. We have seen this confusion more recently again, so that's worrisome to us as industry, but we will continue to strive to make sure that that doesn't happen. We do have emerging regulations. If we look at what's happening in Europe, currently in Europe, most of the all of the oncology products are not reviewed by any regulatory agency. That will be changing. All products will require approval under the new regulatory scheme in the EU. What's also difficult is when non-IVD US regulators give direction to pharmaceutical companies that is not correct. Then what happens is you got the device regulatory bodies and the IVD Indus device going back to the pharmaceutical company saying, well, okay, it doesn't really work that way. Here's what you really need to do. So that's very difficult to overcome. Once a product is launched, I think if I can have one take-home message today, it's the add-ons. These specimens are very, very rare. Do we really need to prove clinical utility again for a device? Or can we just show analytical verification and validity to prove the product works and move forward? Today, we cannot do that. We absolutely have to, if we want to have another drug added to our labeling, we have to find a pharma partner who's willing to share specimens, which they can't always do depending on the informed consent. So this is a huge challenge in the United States, which we're trying to find a path that's the best moving forward. So in conclusion, I think the most important thing you can remember is we are incorporating our final product design into the facilities and faculties around the world as we design these studies. It's very important. We are coordinating the regulatory pathways. We do talk with regulatory agencies all the time through the process. The clinical studies are complex. You're dealing with hundreds of locations, and they are conducted worldwide. And the US FDA has been very good at making sure that individuals, pharma partners, and device companies understand that they do want the products approved together. And I think that's very important so that to the outside world, they know that we're approved and ready to go together. And I want to thank everybody, and I want to thank the Institute of Medicine for giving me the opportunity to share our experiences. Thank you.
Thank you, Karen. And our next speaker is Federico Monzon from Invitae.